Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible. Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Madi Czerwinski, the Director of Campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal and a Women's Leaders in Energy Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Madi, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Always delighted to be on Decouple.
Well, yeah, you were on November of 2020. I pride myself on sort of getting the scoop, and I've been really lucky to have people on for their first interview. Some of my favorites were Meredith Angwin. I read the preprint and got her first interview, broke the news on that amazing resource that I seem to reference like in just about every single podcast. Probably I already have today, but we had Xeon Lights on, I think for her first interview. There's been a few others. Anyway, I won't pat my back too much. A lot's happened, I think, with you since we last talked. A lot of water on the bridge, and I understand some maybe good, maybe bad, or both changes to sort of the energy zeitgeist in the US, which I'm really excited to sort of catch up on. For those who haven't listened already to Madi's amazing interview on Robert Bryce's Power Hungry podcast, make sure you check that out. It was an amazing part of his Blackout Week series on the shuttering of Indian Point. And today I've got Madi back, and unfortunately, it's very pertinent to the closure of Indian Point. We're going to be talking about the nuclear power plants that are under threat in Illinois. And I think look a little bit at what we can learn from Indian Point, what we can do about it, because there's still a bit of time, Madi, I understand.
We got about 2 weeks.
Wow. Okay. So that makes this all the more urgent. Anyway, yeah. Dear listeners, let's get on with this. Madi, before we get into, I don't want to call it the depressing side, but into that struggle. Again, we had in earlier kind of off-air conversations, catching up on what's been going on in the last 6-7 months since we talked. You were actually saying, hey, there's some really great things that have been happening south of the border. So let's start in a bright place.
Yeah. So, things that give me hope since the last time we've spoken. In March, Vogtle started hot functional testing, and it looks like the first reactor is going to be delivered or come online in December of this year. And for people following along with the project, there were definitely times along the way where we just weren't sure if Southern was going to keep on going and if these AP1000s were ever going to see the light of day. So that's really exciting. And then two more nuclear plants received 20-year life extensions recently, Peach Bottom and Surrey nuclear power plant. So they're going to continue operating for at least the next 2 decades, if not beyond that. Now so that the NRC...
That'll get them into their 60s or into their 80s?
80s. And now the NRC is looking at life extensions out to 100 years and beyond. And instead of those 20-year increments, possibly looking at licensing for 40-year increments, which is great.
Yeah, I was just reading Emmett Penny's most recent piece in, I think it's in the American Conservative of all places. Yeah. Very consistent argument. He's still very true to his left roots, but I think has a pretty devastating critique of the left. And it's, what did he say again? It was kind of this lack of any kind of engineering expertise in the modern left, as well as this kind of combination of I'm not going to state it as well as he did, but basically this kind of catastrophism and presentism and a failure to preserve some of the legacies of the past because of a overly broad critique. I'm gonna go read the piece. It's awesome. Yeah, it's great. But what he really talked about was this concept of like these energy cathedrals that lie at the base of American prosperity, and thinking about these things lasting 100 years, it becomes a real metaphor that I think is very apt. So a couple other things. I'm not sure if this is brand new or not, but the issuing of zero emissions credits to sort of balance out the distortions of deregulated energy markets that have been not good for nuclear. Is that a new thing this year, or that's been going on for a while?
So this is the most recent thing was in New Jersey. So back in 2018, 2019, I think 2019,
Mhm.
they established their zero emission certificates program for their nuclear plants, basically saying we need to keep these plants online because of their environmental and economic benefits to our states. We're going to give them a modest subsidy to reward them for their zero emissions, reliable electricity generation.
Mhm.
And the way the legislation works is that they have to reaffirm that decision every 3 years, which is sort of frustrating because it's, the same battle being fought every 3 years. So in April, the Public Utilities Commission of New Jersey, all 5 commissioners unanimously approved the ZECs to continue for the nuclear plants. And were pretty strident in their reasoning for keeping their nuclear plants online, saying things like weather dependent technologies just can't do it. We don't want to go down the same path as California, those sorts of things. So I'm really optimistic about this recognition of nuclear's unique and powerful role in a carbon-free future. So, it's great for the ratepayers of New Jersey. It's great for the citizens who are going to continue breathing cleaner air. It really stands in stark contrast to what happened to their neighbors in New York, which is really unfortunate.
Absolutely. In the context of these, uh, zero emissions credits, there was an interesting piece by Robert Bryce, again, to reference him again, but he deserves it. And it was looking at sort of comparative subsidies, because I think when people hear about a subsidy to nuclear, I think there's a different reaction than, subsidies to wind and solar. But in this piece, he was comparing these subsidies per unit of energy created, and solar was getting 250 times more in federal tax credits than nuclear. And just some other numbers from that article. Just in 2018 alone, wind and solar got about 9.8 billion in tax credits. Hydrocarbons, which people make a stink about, and I think, for good reasons, 3.2 billion, and nuclear got 100 million that year. So, for a potent ever on power source, driving US decarbonization and keeping emissions, as low as possible. I mean, they deserve a little something, given it seems that the market has become so problematic. Now, switching back to Illinois, I think on our last episode, we were talking about Dresden and Byron and how they were under threat, and whether Exelon's claims of the plants no longer being economic. I think some of the workers at the plants were a bit complacent, because they're saying, hey, it's just a power play. They're going to get what they want. We're not maybe at such risk of losing our jobs. It's looking like, no, these jobs are really on the line. Can you maybe, we've explored this a little bit previously on the podcast, but tell me why nuclear plants are becoming uneconomic 30, 40 years into their lifespan, when they're supposed to have paid off, those crippling cost of capital. Nuclear is very capital intensive, and the cost of capital is everything. But typically after 30, 40 years, that's paid off, and then you're running on fairly cheap fuel, or very cheap fuel, really. And the 1,000 or so heavily unionized, well-paid workers that run these plants. Why are these plants becoming uneconomic?
Yeah, so the nuclear plant closures, we've talked about this before, but there are two sort of broad groups of closures in the US. There are the solely political closures, where the plants are economical, they're competitive with the other fuels in their region. They might not be a part of an electricity market, and it's just politicians or environmental groups are just determined to have them closed. So we're really talking about the ones that are actually underwater. And those are mostly happening in restructured electricity markets. You've now had Meredith and Eduardo both sort of give a lot of that background context, so I don't want to sort of reinvent the wheel here. But basically what's happening in Illinois is the 4 plants in the PJM interconnection, which spans from, Illinois to New Jersey, they're being forced to compete with historically cheap natural gas and then subsidized renewables, mostly wind coming in from the Great Plains. So this is really depressing local electricity prices.
And when you say electricity prices, we're talking about like the every 5-minute bid in wholesale price, not necessarily the ratepayer cost of electricity.
Right.
Is that correct?
So it's so complicated. I mean, God bless Meredith Angwin for writing that book because it is a mess. But basically, there are capacity auctions years ahead of time to show like who is going to be sort of on standby, able to deliver and compete in those other 5-minute increment auctions, if that makes sense. But you receive revenue for winning those capacity auctions. And Exelon's plants, the nuclear plants, aren't clearing those. And so they're losing out on that revenue. And the way that nuclear plants work is, like you said, the best way to run them is just always on, constantly. And so if you're suddenly having to ramp up and down to accommodate for the weather, wind blowing in from the west, then it just becomes a lot more difficult. And right now, Exelon is, in the red, and understandably, they're a business. It's not their job to say, well, some of our renewables and gas plants are making money. We'll subsidize our struggling nuclear plants and hope for something better in the future. No, they're a business. They say if this asset is losing money, we have to shut it down. We don't like that. We would rather keep it open, but business is business.
Right. It was really interesting talking to Edgardo Sepulveda. Again, I've had him on for 2 shows. Go back and check that out. But he was talking about how, maybe ironically, maybe not, it tends to be blue states that have these deregulated markets and red states that are still regulated. And that really seems to be determining the viability, the economic viability of these nuclear plants. And listen, I'm fine to keep kind of rehashing and processing this because the economic side of things is not my strong point. So again, so blessed to have these experts that are willing to come on the show and sort of serve as advisors, really. But to summarize in terms of my understanding, let me know if I'm off on this, but we used to structure these markets and anticipate we're going to need this much demand. We'd run base load and kind of build on top of that, and you'd be paid according to the capacity to sort of meet grid reliability standards, et cetera. And now it's, especially in places like Texas where it's energy only, it's just all about the value of these 5-minute increments, and that can really become quite distorted, as we were saying with Meredith Angwin's fatal trifecta of weather dependent renewables backed by gas and really needing energy imports. And on that energy import front, let's talk about what's going to happen, or what could happen, or what will not happen if you and your comrades are effective. What's the plan to replace these plants? Because something I've noticed with Indian Point closure, with the threatened and impending Pickering closure here in Ontario, is that it seems like once the assets are paid for that will be replacing the threatened nuclear plant, it's pretty hard for the best activists in the world to turn that around. I mean, in Ontario Power Generation has spent $4.5 billion on the gas assets that will replace Pickering. Convincing them to change their minds on a climate argument or a clean air argument, it's a bit of a fantasy. And similarly with Indian Point, Cricket Valley plant had been built. You're dealing with major power structures and interests at play once the replacements are there. Is that the situation in Illinois? Have they been, because this decision I think was only announced a year ago, or this threat by Exelon. So have they had time to source the capacity that would replace? Like, it's a lot of generation that would be coming offline, right?
Yeah. So a report from the Brattle Group showed that losing the nuclear plants in PJM would result in increased out-of-state fossil fuel burning, primarily in Indiana and Ohio, to the tune of $483 million annually charged to Illinois ratepayers. So it's basically not only that we would be losing an immense amount of union jobs, immense amount of other jobs and economic activity that are supplied by the nuclear plants, but you would get this massive source of tax revenue and jobs pushed out of state to increase. So Yeah, it's a bad deal all around. Nothing specifically has been built in Illinois, like you said. It's been, not even a full year since the announcement, but that just means there's plenty of coal and natural gas capacity in the PJM market that will replace
Hmm.
these two plants.
No, I mean, it's fascinating. I think the NEI did an analysis in Indian Point, and in addition to those sort of 1,000 jobs directly at the plant, another 9,000 indirect jobs, both in-state and federally around the country, were anticipated to be lost. So, I mean, massive in that regard. And then I think I remember you talking about this on Robert Bryce's podcast, but you said that in some circumstances, subsidies for nuclear actually save the consumer money. And I think that, basically $500 million being spent on out-of-state, mostly fossil generation to replace Byron and Dresden. Is that the mechanism?
Yeah, so Illinois, this battle is not new to Illinois. In 2016, there were two of Exelon's nuclear plants in a different interconnection that were facing the same economic problems. And what the legislature did is something very similar to New Jersey, which is award zero emissions credits. They're all like either RECs or ZECs, and they're all slightly different.
Right.
So I'm trying to keep them straight. But basically modest subsidies to reward the nuclear plants for their reliability and their carbon-free generation.
Mm-hmm.
And a new working paper that came out earlier this year from Carnegie Mellon shows that those subsidies actually saved Illinois ratepayers money. So
Mm-hmm.
that's huge, right? We're talking about modest subsidies being able to keep, I think, around 4,000 union jobs secured, 28,000 indirect jobs within the state, keep the tax base, keep 90% of our carbon-free electricity, which is nuclear power, safe for the next couple decades and beyond. That would be huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like, all of the subsidies that are being required, it really speaks to the fact that, an electricity market is not a free market, as much as people, I think, are attempting, and maybe that's the ideology or the ideological basis for deregulation is that sort of free market fundamentalism. But first of all, this is an essential good. Second of all, consumers can't really choose their generation sources and have that kind of choice. I mean, when I was researching deregulation, there were so many, and I like to go to some YouTube ads to sort of do some less cognitively challenging research in addition to some of the reading that I do around it. But they were all from companies that kind of specialize in creating the right package for you and your business. And this is why deregulation is good, consumer choice. But because it's a really imperfect market, it's like you need to keep adding on layer upon layer upon layer to try and make it actually function and meet an objective. And it's good to see that the objective is starting to say, okay, listen, it's not about meeting a percentage of renewables as our goal, but getting to the lowest carbon emissions, and grid reliability, I think, is being rewarded by these ZECs.
Right. I mean, these restructured markets are basically just trying to think of a PG-13 word, a screwed up Rube Goldberg machine of just like added crazy complexity that only could be thought up by people who weren't in charge of delivering electricity in the physical world. Like, it's so theoretical and crazy. So, and it doesn't incentivize reliability, which is the issue that we're seeing in California and Texas. So the first thing Illinois could do to sort of push back against that without completely dismantling the market is at least put nuclear on an even playing field and give it these very modest subsidies. So the issue right now is that the Governor Pritzker, acknowledges that the nuclear plants are important to the state's carbon targets, and he wants to keep them online. The issue is what he's offering in his proposed bill is not nearly adequate to protect Byron and Dresden or reverse that decision. And LaSalle and Braidwood, the other two plants, would likely, it wouldn't do anything for them. So they would still be at severe risk. And so the question is, what does he know? What do the legislators here know that somehow didn't get passed on to New Jersey, where they said, no, $10 a megawatt is absolutely worth it to protect our nuclear plants in the same electricity market. And by the way, their electricity or their nuclear plants don't have the same downside like price exposure as our plants do.
Right.
So it's not even just like, can we get action passed in the next 2 weeks, but is it going to be enough to keep Byron and Dresden online and enough to protect the other two plants that will likely be soon to follow?
Right. Yeah, because I was reading, LaSalle, Brentwood, in total, I think at present there's 9 gigawatts of nuclear power at risk, 10% of the nation's total. I mean, I was looking at some projections that were saying by 2050, as things are heading, it's looking like there'll only be, I think, 8 gigawatts of nuclear online in 2050. Obviously, you got something to say about that, and Campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal is fighting for 50 by 50, 50% nuclear power by 2050. But I mean, Biden has said that we're headed towards completely decarbonized electricity by 2035. I mean, I'm torn because I'm a fan of ambitious goals and what do I call it again? Aspirational politics, shall we say? At the same time, I think the more that I've learned about this, and it's been such a wonderful journey with Decouple, I think 65 episodes in, I've been reading voraciously, really reference Václav Smil a lot, who's done a lot of the very numerate work on energy transitions. I mean, it's like, to be honest, it's completely unrealistic. But it's even more unrealistic when you're talking about basically allowing this industry and this sector to die because of deregulation. And we're going to be doing a show again with Edgardo Sepulveda coming up on basically it's going to be a little bit of a murder mystery maybe on who got rich off of deregulation, because there's a lot of lawyers and other figures who have made a lot of money off this. The ratepayers paid the price. Okay, so we've talked a bit about what can be done at a state level. This episode's getting very referential, but Robert Bryce had a great piece in January after, I think in Biden's inaugural speech, he mentioned climate change was very heavily focused. I think he only mentioned nuclear once or twice and more on the sort of defense side of things. But Bryce said, listen, if you're serious about climate change, then there should be something like an executive order that there should be no more premature closures of nuclear plants. Let's talk a bit more on the kind of federal level. I mean, in your opinion, is something like that politically possible, or I don't know, what's your sense of what's happening federally?
Right. Well, I would say if it's, to answer, is it possible? Luckily, political problems are a lot easier problems to solve than physical problems,
Right.
And so that's on our side for nuclear. The question is there the political will to get it done? It's been a lot of talk and not a lot of walk at the federal level thus far. Mm-hmm. The bills that have been proposed have been extremely frustrating in terms of a mechanism to actually protect the existing plants. It's something like, so all of the plants that are at risk due to economics are going to say how much they need to stay online. And then the federal government is going to prioritize saving them in order of who needs the least amount of help.
Okay.
Like, it makes no sense. Right. And then it's a bit difficult because as rumors swirl about, Biden's administration stepping in for these closures, there's been talk that any nuclear plants that are receiving state help won't receive federal help. So what do they do? Like, seriously, it's a good question. What do you do? It's a game of chicken, right? Illinois, where you feel that there is help right around the corner, but you have your plants set to close in like 4 months and 6 months respectively.
Right.
It's a big question mark. And, so I don't know if that's extremely helpful. What I will say I think the issue should be nationalized. I definitely think does deserve federal action. And not only because that would obviously do an immense amount for America's climate goals and sort of take care of this all at once, but also because we're seeing a lot of the same groups in all of these local fights. So the same groups that were responsible for the decision to close Diablo Canyon in 2025 are some of the groups intervening and pushing a bill in Illinois called CEJA, which says, well, all of our nuclear—
What does that stand for?
It's, again, they're all the same. Let me double check. It's the Climate Energy Jobs Act. I hope that's— no,
not to be confused with the
Clean Energy Jobs Act. Sorry.
Not to be confused with the Climate Union Jobs Act.
Climate Union Jobs Act. You can see what this is. Yeah.
Right.
But basically they say it's an anti-nuclear phase out bill. They said we're going to have all of our nuclear gone by 2050 and it's going to be 100% renewable. So they're talking about wiping away 90% of Illinois' clean electricity in the next 3 decades in an attempt to replace it with wind and solar, which hasn't worked for California, which is the early aggressive leader of this strategy. And yeah, so that's just frustrating.
I mean, there's this, yeah, I mean, with the Indian Point closure, there was a lot of language around like, don't worry, that clean energy will be offset by new renewables, as if the focus is replacing clean energy with clean energy, although apples and oranges don't really replace each other. But there's also this kind of localism. I mean, that again, like climate is something that doesn't, or air pollution as well. They don't respect your little territorial boundaries. And I find this happens over and over again, whether it's in Ontario, New York, or Illinois. It's not about just offsetting the local nuclear that'll be shut down. Like this is a global problem, right? And these goals, for instance, I mean, we have to be thinking more globally about this. I mean, it's been very hard to sort of be kind of neutral on this moving train wreck towards, you know, the most sort of apparently concerned people driving this train into a climate meltdown, catastrophe, whatever we want to call it, right? The metric that, you know, I was kind of frustrated myself for not having heard of before, but that was the focus of my last show with Edgardo Sepulveda, is the climate abatement cost. And again, kudos to Robert Bryce for bringing this to my attention with his interview with Rainer Kuhr. But, you know, this really illustrates I think the reason why we're all so upset about this and have a hard time sort of maintaining our composure, beyond people losing good jobs and communities being devastated. But just on a decarbonization effort, again, this is a New England study, which I think is going to be largely, you know, reflective of Illinois and New York. But the cost to abate 1 ton of CO2, right? The whole reason that we are adding generation to our system, which we're not necessarily increasing our demand, but we're doing that to displace fossil and displace carbon. Rooftop solar, $800 a ton. Utility wind and solar, $300 a ton. An extra $300 if you're backing it up with batteries, so $600 a ton. Nuclear, $25 a ton to displace a ton of CO2. And with a carbon tax at $50, it's really the only one that's quote unquote affordable, if that's the price that we're willing to set for carbon.
Right. And you bring up Indian Point, which the same organization or analytics firm, Synapse, that said in 2017, no, guys, we promise Indian Point is going to be able to be replaced with energy efficiency and renewables. That's the same exact firm that the governor of Illinois just got a report from saying like, oh no, $1 per megawatt hour for Byron and $3.50 per megawatt hour for Dresden is more than enough. They're not in that much financial duress. So you can see, again, we're seeing the same actors basically saying either the nuclear plants can go, or, I mean, they can stay, but they barely need anything. And so at this point, and let me add that this same group put out a study that said New Jersey did not need to subsidize its nuclear plants, and that evidence was rejected by the Board of Public Utilities. They did not decide to accept it as evidence when debating ZECs. So again, we're seeing these same groups in all of these fights. It clearly just needs to be a federal action so that it's not on the states, because this really is a federal problem, and that we're not constantly on our back foot repeating these fights every 4 years in Illinois, every 3 years in New Jersey.
Yeah. I mean, it would seem like the better model than saying, okay, if you get a state subsidy, nothing from the federals, is like the feds could match the state and they could work together, right? Like it seems as simple as that, if that was the actual objective. But again, I mean, these costs, when you look at the carbon abatement costs, are just a total no-brainer. And, you know, again, that's just, for me, this is the new lens through which to, you know, make judgments about any decarbonization tool or technology, whether it's retrofitting our homes, whether it's choosing which electricity generation to use. Hold on, I think I'm losing you for a second here. Can you still hear me okay?
I can hear you. Yep.
Just broke up a tiny bit. Okay, no worries, no worries. Yeah, and I mean these so-called green groups, so-called climate groups, I think are just really exposing what their agenda is. I mean, they're primarily anti-nuclear and only secondarily climate. I'd say probably primarily anti-nuclear, secondarily pro-renewables and kind of renewables advertisers or marketers, and thirdly, that's where climate fits in, is after those two other priorities. All right, so let's move on a little bit. We were talking a bit about sort of federal and state actors, and the zeitgeist, the energy zeitgeist in the U.S. There's a few interesting figures at play here. Jennifer Granholm, the DOE secretary, who's floated this idea of subsidies to keep nuclear open. John Kerry, who killed the integral molten fast reactor project under Clinton, but has said things recently like solving climate change will require technologies that we don't yet have, and that 50% of these reductions might come from new tech. And of course, he points to sort of Bill Gates, TerraPower. Those are sort of the pro-nuclear voices, I think, within the Biden administration. And there's, Gina McCarthy, the former NRDC president and CEO, who is the new and first ever national climate advisor. So how do you see these voices kind of playing out within the administration? Are you hopeful? Who do you think is more prominent? Well, give us a little bit of the sort of political game here, if you can, if you're at liberty to speak of such things.
Yeah, I guess I don't have like a ton of insider information to divulge, but it really is, there's a decent amount of talk and no action right now. So we're just going to have to wait and see. I think for Granholm, Palisades in Michigan, her home state, is facing a premature closure in 2022. Is she going to step in time to protect that source of clean energy in her own backyard?
Right.
As far as John Kerry, I mean, all one has to do is look at France in the 70s, like 50 years ago, to know that's simply not true. They were the first sort of successful decarbonization experiment before it was even about decarbonizing. It was about not being reliant on oil during the oil crises or as a result of the oil crises. So it's like a lot of it feels like a lot of kicking the can down the road. Like, oh, we need tech that hasn't been invented yet. Oh, it's not going to come from this generation of nuclear power. It's going to be the designs that only exist on paper. There's just not a lot of physical material language that's coming out of the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. So I hope something changes, but I'm not as optimistic as other pro-nuclear people are about the administration's willingness to help with what actually matters, which is keeping the plants online and deploying the technology that we already have as quickly as possible.
And in terms of like the underlying realpolitik behind that, like, do you think this is a concern about sort of like losing or splitting the base? I mean, and I guess in every locale, there's different attitudes, more strongly or weakly held towards nuclear energy. It's interesting to see Again, I think this is very illustrative, right? Like AOC talking about the Green New Deal, like the door is open to nuclear, but she, I think, fairly actively supported the closure of Indian Point. I mean, there's a real contradiction that needs to get sorted out here, and a clarification of what the commitment is. But I think because the Democrats have a lot of green groups associated with them, the Green Left to some degree, and there's an anti-nuclear commitment that's kind of fairly pervasive within that scene, that seems to be a kind of an underlying geopolitical tension, or not geopolitical, realpolitik tension. How are you seeing that playing out in various districts in terms of your work with the campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal? I saw on your website you have sort of regional directors and things like that. Is there, I remember when I was very early on in this game, I was like, all we've got to do is like convince Greta Thunberg and AOC, and they'll become these advocates, and then they'll be these thought leaders, and they'll shift the environmental movement. But I've realized how naive that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was something extremely difficult for me, even like emotionally, and a lot of people who are pro-nuclear and consider themselves on the left have this same experience, like that people that we've like really respected, voices that we think are really powerful on the left, have a completely incoherent position on nuclear. And any sort of keeping the door open, or it could be a possibility, is really just cover for, we want to shut the plants down, but we want to protect ourselves from the bludgeon of how can you close the door on a technology that's carbon free.
And that's the basis of more than 50% of your guys' clean energy, right? Is that the stat in the States? Nuclear is
almost it's 90% of our clean electricity, and it's almost 60% of our electricity, in-state electricity mix.
In Illinois, but for the whole country, for the whole country, it's 51 or something, right?
Yeah. Right. And about 20% of our total electricity. So I think, where some people might see progress in messaging, maybe I'm just too cynical. I think I'm in general like a very optimistic person, hence the campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal. But I read that as the evolution of anti-nuclearism. I mean, you've seen it a lot too, like, oh, we would be okay with nuclear, it's just not cost effective, it just doesn't make sense. And it's like, I would guarantee you that as soon as it becomes cost effective, even though, I mean, ratepayers in Georgia are already paying for Vogtle, and their electricity is still cheaper for it, and they'll get decades of clean electricity. So set that aside. But I think if it did become economically feasible, then they would find something else to say. Right. Then it becomes about justice and mining and extractionism, even though we know that nuclear is the best source of technology to minimize environmental degradation, to minimize mining and extraction impacts. So again, I'm just all about action. When I see movement at the federal level, then I'll be able to come out and I'll be the first one singing its praises. But right now it's all talk, and I don't really trust it.
And like with the campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal, you have been speaking with some politicians. Are you getting, like, how are those conversations going?
I mean, it's much different at the state level than at the federal level. And it really varies from state to state. So in Illinois, we're very lucky in that a lot of office holders on both the left and the right recognize the importance of nuclear for jobs, for clean energy. I mean, some of the most, like, the strongest supporters are Republicans who want to help Pritzker and his clean energy goals. That's really something great to see. A lot of Democrats in Chicago recognize the benefit of nuclear power in protecting against air pollution, particularly, in impoverished parts of the state. So that's really great. And I think that may be the thing that pushes us over the finish line if we win in Illinois. It's different at the federal level. I mean, you have sort of Green New Deal on the one hand, but I don't, that's sort of more even culture war, I would argue. A lot of the serious people in energy policy do not think that pursuing 100% wind, water, solar is, a viable path and worth talking about. But still, it's very powerful. Like you said, environmental groups in this country are powerful. NRDC gets hundreds of millions of dollars in funding a year. That
they get 100 million funding a year, or they have like assets worth 200 million?
They have budgets of, I think, like almost $200 million a year.
It's insane, especially like, there's this a common accusation against advocates like yourself is that you're a shill of industry. I mean, the nuclear advocates that I know are doing this all for the love, volunteer, getting by on absolute shoestring budgets. I mean, there's no greater sort of David and Goliath struggle, and it's very unfortunate that nuclear advocates need to be pitched against environmental organizations and not, say, fossil interest that nuclear threatens as well for interest. For example. But getting back to this cost issue, I mean, there's a real cost to the energy choices that we make, and I think in Texas, where about 60 billion was spent on what are called reliably unreliable sources, particularly wind, and the $5 billion interconnector that was installed there. You're more at risk for consequences from extreme weather blackout. And this isn't, again, this isn't to say that other sources didn't fail. I mean, to be accurate, nuclear failed the least with a single reactor going down. But that blackout apparently cost Texas around $200 billion. And you think about, I mean, that's 10 Vogels.
Over 200 lives.
Yeah, more importantly, right? But I mean, in terms of the economics, those costs pile up, and you think about what, if there's proactively invested in reliable clean energy that would come to the rescue at that time. I think that really needs to be factored in beyond carbon abatement cost and just ratepayer prices.
Yeah, that's something we've been talking a lot about in Illinois, is pointing to Texas. I mean, the polar vortex was affecting, most of the middle of the country, and all 6 of our nuclear plants in Illinois were operating at almost full capacity, powering hospitals, schools, homes throughout that entire cold snap, while Texas was dealing with a major humanitarian crisis. So these nuclear plants are important. It's everything. It's the cost of carbon. It's the reliability. I mean, mostly those two. It's the jobs. It's the environmental protection. I saw something. I'm a little afraid I haven't memorized these numbers, but I was looking at land impacts today, or a report that said we would lose like 10 to 15% of our soybean agriculture in Illinois with X percentage of build out of wind and solar. And I mean, that's something really important to think about, is that the land use, we have some of the most
fertile,
productive agriculture in the country and in the world, and displacing any of that, it has to be replaced somewhere. I mean, hopefully not deforested parts of the Amazon, or but seriously, it's important to think about those things, and it just gets back to energy density.
So let's maybe close off a little bit in our last segment here, talking about what's coming up. What are you going to do about it, Madi? In terms of these threatened closures, what are you up to right now? It's a very tight timeline. You were saying like 2 weeks or something, and the Legislative Assembly's off for the summer or something.
Yep. So the spring session ends May 31st. And so depending on what comes out of that, we'll know if it's enough to keep Byron and Dresden online. And then we'll probably hear the implications for LaSalle and Braidwood as well. So I'm super lucky. Like you said, we have sort of regional directors at the Campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal. Alan Metzger has been doing this in Chicago for over a decade now, pro-nuclear environmentalism and activism. And he is great. He, myself, Mark and Paris, who you've had on Decouple, a bunch of nuclear engineering students from UIUC, ANS. We have this big group that's been really pushing hard on the message, just whatever you do, keep the damn plants online. And so we're doing social media campaigns, we're calling legislators, we're sending emails, we're sending postcards, we sent Valentines on Valentine's Day, pro-nuclear Valentines. And now in this last sort of 2-week push, we're holding a stand-up in Springfield on Monday. Just like, all the legislators need to do is look out their window and they'll see how many jobs we're really talking about when we lose a nuclear plant.
And they're going to see that because there'll be 1,000 construction helmets out there, right?
Well, you just gave it away, Chris.
Oh.
No, just kidding. Yes. So we're gonna, I don't know. Honestly, we're all, like you said, I do this completely volunteer basis. I shouldn't say that. I get like $100 a month from my loving fans on Patreon, but like, we just sort of we're scrappy. We just pull this together any way we can. Somehow we're going to display 1,000 helmets, whether it's on a fence or in a yard, we'll figure it out. But you just got to do what it takes to get it done when 4.3 gigawatts of clean energy is on the line, when Illinois' clean energy future is on the line.
One of the other stunts that you did for your stand-up that we were talking about in November was this biker rally. Any plans to get the bikers out again?
They are ready to, they are mobilized. They're ready to come wherever we're going to be. We thought Springfield, because it's like, that's where the action's going to take place. And I mean, look, even if something comes out on May 31st that isn't adequate, we still have till September and November till the lights go out on these plants. And you can bet that we're going to continue to fight for them until they're actually offline.
Yeah, it was really interesting having Izuru and Dietmar on. I gained a huge appreciation for the amount of work and how, I don't know what to call it. Like I'd call it professionalism, but it's truly amateur for the love. But I mean, really good reports. They managed to break into the New York Times and a number of other media organizations. I think that's a big challenge that nuclear advocates face. I'm not sure exactly why. I mean, I think that it's a very interesting and controversial story. One would think that reporters would be all over that, maybe up readership. I'm not sure if it's because they get angry letters of complaint from well-funded environmental groups, or, whether they interpret us as being shills and therefore, hey, there's just the evil nuclear industry's way of sort of getting free advertising. I mean, what's your take on that? And what's your success been like at getting, especially in the Illinois issue, into the media?
Yeah, again, we benefit in Illinois from being slightly less anti-nuclear all around than like New York or California, say. So I've had an op-ed in the Chicago Tribune, and just like 2 weeks ago in the Daily Herald. The Mothers for Nuclear in Chicago have had a piece in the Tribune, ANS students. So luckily, we're able to sort of get into the papers, the biggest papers in the city, and that's been really great. But yeah, I mean, it's hard, and to some extent, I don't blame people who do have that read on me or some of the advocates, and that, like, when I had to submit testimony to the Illinois legislators or the Public Utility Commission hearings on some of these bills, it's me and all of the fossil fuel industry coming out against this bill. And so, yeah, that doesn't look great, as much as I can say, like, no, I'm the true environmentalist. I don't take any energy money at all. I'm completely industry free. This is out of concern for the environment, for carbon emissions, for jobs. Like, at the end of the day, it's me backed by all the natural gas and coal lobbyists in the state.
Sorry, so what's their role in this? Are they opposing the closure of the plants, or is that what you were trying to say there? Or?
No. It basically that in a lot of the clean energy bills, they're obviously against them. And so I'm for clean energy, but against clean energy bills that don't focus on protecting the nuclear plants.
So the CJA versus the SUJA.
Right. Yes, exactly. And the really great thing about SUJA, KUJA, I've never known what the official name is, but
this is the union one, the clean
the
Union Jobs Association, Climate Union Jobs. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the one you like.
Yes, that's the one I like. And because it prioritizes protecting the nuclear plants and properly recognizes the importance of them to Illinois' clean energy future.
Is that because the unions see the kind of jobs disparity between nuclear and its clean alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, most of the unionized jobs in clean energy in the state are the nuclear plants. It's like 1,500 full-time unionized employees between Byron and Dresden.
Right.
So
I mean, this is like that mythical, nostalgic, intergenerational, well-paying industrial jobs that basically, I'm trying to think of a sector outside of nuclear where that still exists, where you might go and work at the same plant as your dad or your grandpa, make great wages, support your family,
and without a college degree in a lot of cases.
Right.
So that outside of the nuclear sector, I really don't know. But another really important part of this bill of KUJA is that they have basically labor standards higher than the industry for renewables development in the states to make sure that the benefit of deploying solar and wind stays, in state rather than solely being for hedge funds and banks.
Right.
It requires them to have some, or I think, I don't know exactly what percentage of union labor on those projects. It also talks about like decarbonizing schools and electric school buses. I mean, it's a really great bill. In the end, I think what's going to happen is there's going to be sort of a piecemeal energy package that pulls from all of the proposed bills. I think there are 6 right now, and we'll see sort of a mashup of all 6. And so really, it's not even just being behind any one bill at this point. It's got to be the nukes. It has to be protecting the nukes.
And then, I mean, you mentioned sort of, who shows up at these hearings in terms of activists, pro or anti-nuclear, various energy interests. But I think something that's really struck me is the fact that, both in Ontario and really basically in most jurisdictions that aren't like France with like a national sort of electricity sector organization like Électricité de France, EDF. There's probably other examples I'm not thinking of in the Asian countries. But in Canada and the US anyway, the entities that own the nuclear plants own fossil plants. And so there's this sort of natural conflict. If you're making more money off gas, then we'll let one go, right? So, and in terms of how that translates into lobbying, it seems like there's not really a strong industry voice anyway for nuclear. And there are associations, but in terms of what I should say is like utility lobbying kind of voice, that just doesn't really exist for nuclear in the way that like the anti-nuclear people imagined it anyway.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, utilities are they have that same conflict of interest everywhere, where they're developing renewables and natural gas and have coal plants alongside their nuclear fleet. So it's really just what's making money and what isn't. Illinois is a particularly fun political battle when it comes to the utilities, because last year it came out that ComEd was involved in a bribery scandal with the Democratic Speaker of the House.
What's ComEd? Sorry, for international listeners.
It's the distribution side of Exelon.
Gotcha.
So, not their generating asset company, but the actual utility. And so nobody wants to be seen as helping Exelon at this point. So
Right.
I can or a reason that the governor would be so sort of stingy on these subsidies and really reluctant to help the nuclear plants is he doesn't want to look like he's in the pocket of the big utility. You know, as Robert Bryce says, nobody wants to bake a cake for Exelon right now.
Right.
So that's complicated things further, where they're just sort of quiet, and all they can do is respond to say, like, this would be adequate for reversing the decision. This probably wouldn't, but they're not fighting. They're just kind of sitting on the sidelines watching this go down. And I don't know if that helps or hurts, like that they just stay out of our way and we can just battle it out with the environmental groups, or if they, obviously it would be helpful to have, like you said, sort of a fully pro-nuclear industry voice in this, but that's not what we're seeing.
Right. No, I had a filmmaker friend who was looking for funding for some like post-production stuff on his film. And he went to some of the utilities and they were like, well, you don't say nice things about coal, and part of our fleet is coal. So no, so that was interesting. Yeah, I mean, just in closing, I guess there's this essay that Ted Nordhaus wrote that I really enjoyed. It was called "The Empty Radicalism of the Climate Apocalypse," and he kind of imagined, I think, I forget the guy's first name, but Inslee, who was really kind of the climate candidate for the Democratic Party, ultimately unsuccessful, and imagined you sort of, if you were really going to take climate seriously, what that might look like in terms of like a bold policy, and it would involve nationalization of the grid and a whole bunch of measures. But it's just interesting, like how humble that can be in terms of, the Biden administration at least signaling, I think what Bryce calls the bully pulpit, that there should be a moratorium on nuclear plant closures and premature plant closures. That's a pretty momentous step. And in the setting of New York, where more wind and solar so more capacity generation was lost at Indian Point from one of the reactors being closed, the last one, than the entire output of the wind and solar fleet. I mean, again, in my head, I was just like, this is the equivalent of someone taking a hammer, smashing every single solar panel, taking a cutting torch, chopping down every single wind turbine in a couple hours in one morning. And I think that's, what explains the outrage. And again, for me, the kind of lack of composure on this issue. I really don't want to be a yes man on any interview, but this, as someone who's very concerned about climate, clean air, good jobs, it's just really clear the tragedy of these closures and threatened closures.
I think like the piece that you alluded to before by Emmett Penny that just came out yesterday really does a great job of summarizing the situation. Is that we have this inheritance from decades before, and we've done a terrible job of stewarding it. Mm-hmm. And what we really need to be doing is, delivering more of these clean energy cathedrals, because it really is going to shape the future of what our country, of what the world looks like. I mean, it's that big of a deal. This isn't just I think a lot of my friends and family who don't fully understand what I do think it's weird that I get emotional over a power plant, but this isn't just a power plant. This is the American dream, a clean energy future. Mm-hmm. It matters, each and every one of these plans. So as much as I'm excited to put out some bold new plans for the federal level, like write more policy papers, get some feedback, continuing to push what I think is possible for nuclear in the country, the most important thing is protecting what we have.
And that's what the carbon abatement cost metric would say, $25 a ton.
Yep.
Alrighty. Just for our listeners, we'll put this in the show notes. But tell me, how people can join and follow Campaign for Green New Deal, and B, how they can get involved in Illinois, both if they're local or if they're international, because again, air pollution and climate does not respect boundaries.
Absolutely. So you can follow us by signing up on the form on our website, gndcampaign.org. So I'll be sending out updates, especially about Illinois, and then going forward, just a bunch of the publications that are in the pipeline. And then in terms of Illinois, honestly, tweeting, social media really helps. Sending emails. We have people, the Nuclear in New York team has been really active in getting in touch with our politicians. We have friends in California fighting the Diablo fight who are emailing. And so as many emails as you can find. If you want, please email me at madison@gndcampaign.org, and I will send you CEJA co-sponsors that we're trying to get in touch with, phone numbers. But at this point, just letting Illinois know that the country is watching us and what we do is going to matter is just of the utmost importance.
Yeah, it's incredibly short notice, but you can imagine solidarity demonstrations happening in these other areas as well. But yeah. Okay, Madi, so much we could talk about, but we're just over an hour now. A pleasure having you on, and looking forward to seeing how this goes.
Yeah, I'm going to be busy, very busy over the next 2 weeks, but I'm excited to catch up with you after that so we can talk about more of the aspirational politics I've been working out and less on the doom and gloom and battle.
Yeah, we'll play some offense and less defense going forward.
Right.
Okay, Madi, all the best. We'll talk soon.
All right. Take care, Chris.
Bye for now. If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.